When Daniel Mercer appeared at the door of a remote medical facility in Colorado in 2017, he was almost unrecognizable, emaciated, with matted hair and beard, tattered clothes, and walking like someone who had just emerged from the wilderness. The man had gone missing 3 years earlier while hiking alone in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, one of the most rugged and inaccessible canyons in America, where he was presumed to have died in a terrain-related accident. But what truly sent chills down the spines of the first people who came into contact with Daniel was not his ravaged appearance. The most terrifying part was what he began to say about those 3 years, about the place where he had been held, and about the person who had turned the heart of the canyon into a prison no one could see. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On an early morning of a late autumn day, the small parking lot at the edge of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison was almost empty, with only the sound of wind blowing along the sheer rock walls and faint light reflecting off the towering basalt cliffs, when Daniel Mercer turned off his car engine and locked the door for the last time, before setting out on the solo hiking trip he had planned for weeks. The Black Canyon is not a place for casual strolls. Its terrain is notorious for its overwhelming depth, narrow trails clinging to nearly vertical cliffs, and vast areas with no cell service or radio signal, where even a small mistake can lead to serious consequences. Daniel was experienced with such solo journeys, viewing hiking as a way to disconnect from everyday life, and this trip had been carefully planned with a specific route, a same-day return time, and details shared in advance with his family. According to records at the trailhead, Daniel started from the departure point in the morning, when temperatures were still low, the sky was clear, there were no severe weather warnings, and initial conditions were considered stable for an experienced hiker. He carried standard gear for a day trip, with no signs of preparing for an overnight stay, and proceeded alone as per his announced plan. For the first several hours, everything went normally, with no witnesses reporting unusual behavior or Daniel veering onto a dangerous road, and his last contact with family occurred at the agreed time, brief, calm, simply confirming progress and reiterating the expected return time to the car. After that point, Daniel vanished from all communication. As the sun gradually sank into the canyon and the light was swallowed by the rock walls, he did not appear at the rendezvous as planned. At first his family assumed he might be delayed, due to the terrain, or resting longer than usual, a not uncommon possibility for those on long trails, but the prolonged wait in silence, combined with no response to calls or messages, quickly turned patience into clear anxiety. When night fell, and the Black Canyon sank into its familiar dangerous stillness, the family had to face the reality that Daniel had not returned and could not be reached in any way. A call to the police was made with full details of the route, departure time, weather conditions, and last contact time, officially turning Daniel's solo hiking trip into a missing person case in one of the most rugged and inaccessible areas of the United States. Right after Daniel Mercer's family completed the call to the police on the night he did not return, the missing person report was transferred directly to the ranger force responsible for the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, where any case of no contact within the scheduled time frame is evaluated at a high severity level due to the terrain's characteristics and limited accessibility. The on-duty rangers reviewed all initial information, including the time Daniel left the trailhead, the planned route, weather conditions on the day, his personal hiking experience, and the last contact time, thereby determining that this was not a typical delay situation, but a missing person case with potential life-threatening risks. Early the next morning, as the first light of day began to shine down the sheer deep rock walls of the canyon, the ranger team deployed the first search step by cordoning off the entire trail that Daniel was believed to have taken, starting from the departure point, the main trail sections, the narrow curves along the cliffs, and areas frequently prone to slips or disorientation. The rangers conducted checks of the trail surface, natural rock steps, and familiar resting spots for hikers, looking for footprints, slide marks, pieces of fabric, or any items that might have been dropped, but the hard rock surface mixed with loose gravel, and the canyon's characteristic strong winds, made human traces difficult to remain clear. When no direct evidence was found within the initial narrow scope, the search command decided to escalate the scale, activating the dedicated search and rescue force with participation from multiple different units. Local volunteer teams, with years of experience in canyon rescue operations, were mobilized to sweep adjacent areas to the trail, while professional cliff climbing groups were deployed to access the vertical walls and deep rock ledges below, where a person could fall without leaving clear signs from above. Rescue helicopters began reconnaissance flights along the length of the canyon, flying low along the rock walls to search for human shapes, clothing, or unusual movement in low-light areas, while maintaining communication with ground teams to adjust the search scope according to each priority zone. In parallel, drones were deployed in narrower and more dangerous sections, where helicopters could not safely approach, to capture detailed images of cracks, rock ledges and dry creek beds, places that could obstruct visibility from above. The cliff climbing teams rappelled down into each area, assessed as high risk based on previous accident statistics in the park, carefully checking every meter of rock under rapidly changing light conditions and strong winds, a task that was both time-consuming and potentially risky for the rescue personnel themselves. During the deployment, the Rangers continuously communicated with Daniel's family to gather additional information about his personal habits, physical endurance capabilities, experience handling emergencies, and whether he had ever deviated from planned routes on previous trips in order to build plausible scenarios for the disappearance. However, this data did not lead to any clear hypothesis. Daniel was described as disciplined, rarely changing plans, and with no history of taking risks beyond safety limits. As many days passed without discovering signs of an accident or personal items, the search scope had to be expanded beyond the main trail, including distant rock ledges, rarely used paths, and areas completely outside communication coverage, significantly increasing the complexity of the operation. Pressure gradually mounted as time dragged on, because in the harsh environment of the Black Canyon, survival chances drop quickly if a person is injured, trapped, or disoriented, without the ability to self-rescue. Nevertheless, after many days of continuous deployment involving helicopters, drones, cliff climbing teams, and widespread search and rescue forces, the initial search phase still yielded no verifiable results. There were no indications that Daniel had fallen into the canyon, no evidence he left the area by other means, and no personal items discovered that could prove his location or condition, leaving an inexplicable void between the clear plan of the hiking trip and the absolute silence of the terrain where he had vanished. This very deadlock forced the command team of the operation at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison to adjust their strategy, narrow the scope of access, and shift to resweeping previously checked areas with a higher level of detail, with the goal of finding the smallest signs that might have been overlooked during the initial deployment phase. And during that resweeping process, a discovery emerged, not enough to explain Daniel's disappearance, but enough to shake the entire hypothesis of a simple accident. During one recheck of a rock ledge offset from the main trail, geographically not too far from the path, but obscured by fractured terrain and protruding boulders, a ranger discovered a personal item confirmed to belong to Daniel, based on identifying features provided by the family. This was the first, and also the only time in the entire search operation that any of Daniel's belongings were found. The item lay isolated on a relatively flat rock surface, not crushed, without signs of a long slide, and with no major disturbances of gravel or loose soil around it, factors typically associated with a fall from considerable height. The discovery location was immediately secured, coordinates recorded, the scene photographed, and thoroughly analyzed, because according to the preliminary assessment, this site did not match any of the typical terrain accident scenarios that had been constructed in the preceding days. If Daniel had slipped from the main trail, the natural fall trajectory in the Black Canyon's terrain structure would carry the victim down to deeper cliffs or treacherous crevices, areas that the cliff climbing teams had thoroughly checked without finding any human traces or additional items. The appearance of the item at a relatively clean and more accessible point, compared to the most dangerous zones raised questions about how it got there, but there was no physical evidence strong enough to answer that question with certainty. After completing the scene documentation, the search teams expanded the sweep around the discovery area, carefully checking nearby rock ledges, narrow cracks and the slopes below, in hopes of finding more gear, biological traces, or a body, but the results remained completely empty. No additional personal items of Daniel's were found, no clothing, no backpack, no signs that he had stopped, rested, or attempted to move away from the area after the item became separated from him. This solitary discovery, though important for the record, was not sufficient to determine Daniel's final location or reconstruct a logical sequence of events. In parallel with analyzing the item, terrain and rescue experts continued to evaluate the likelihood of an accident in the specific context of the day Daniel went missing, including stable weather conditions, good visibility, no rain, snow, or unusually strong winds, and the fact that Daniel was a long-time experienced hiker, familiar with moving independently in harsh environments. These factors reduced the probability of a serious random accident, but did not completely rule out the possibility of a small mistake occurring at an unfortunate moment, especially in an area where deviating just a few steps could lead to irreversible consequences. Historical park statistics were brought into consideration, showing that there had been cases of disappearances or fatalities where no body was found, due to victims falling into areas almost impossible to access or completely obscured from view, even with helicopter and drone support. However, in most of those cases, there usually existed at least a continuous chain of traces or multiple items found at different elevations, something that did not occur in Daniel's case. As many more search days passed without new discoveries, the command team was forced to weigh the option of continuing a costly and dangerous operation for rescue personnel against the realistic chances of finding further evidence. The decision to scale down the search was made after consulting the involved units, shifting from active search status to passive search, in which rangers and park staff would continue to keep an eye on the area during routine activities, and respond if new reports came in from visitors, climbers, or external sources. The case file was updated with all collected data, including the sole personal item discovery, scene analysis results, terrain assessments, and search and rescue force reports. Since there was no evidence indicating third-party involvement, no signs of struggle, no criminal leads, and no body or biological traces discovered, the case was administratively classified as an accidental disappearance, reflecting the assumption that Daniel most likely met with an accident while hiking in extremely rugged and inaccessible terrain. This conclusion was not an absolute affirmation of what happened, but rather a practical synthesis of the limitations in searching and the available evidence, officially closing the initial investigation phase and leaving Daniel Mercer's disappearance as an unresolved case file, where the final answer was swallowed by the very silence and harshness of the Black Canyon. Until 3 years later, when an event completely outside any anticipated scenario unexpectedly occurred at a frontline medical facility in a remote area of western Colorado, where staff admitted a severely emaciated man, brought in during the night by 2 highway maintenance workers, after they found him stumbling near a deserted dirt road, far from populated areas, and with almost no public transportation. The man carried no identification, no phone, wallet, watch, or any personal belongings, the clothes on him old, worn, torn, covered in long accumulated dirt, and unsuitable for the current weather conditions, indicating they had been worn continuously for a long time without replacement or laundering. When brought into the emergency area, doctors immediately noted the patient's physical condition at an alarming level, with signs of prolonged malnutrition, significant weight loss relative to height, severe muscle mass loss, especially in the shoulder, thigh, and calf areas, pale, dry skin, numerous scratches, and overlapping old and new scars, some long healed, but without proper medical care. Initial tests showed the man's body had abnormally adapted to prolonged energy deficiency, with slow heart rate, low blood pressure, reduced physiological reflexes, signs typically seen only in cases severely restricted in food rations and freedom of movement for many months or years. When medical staff attempted to communicate to determine identity, the man responded slowly, taking many seconds or even tens of seconds to process simple questions, eyes frequently avoiding direct contact, voice weak, hoarse, and fragmented, answers scattered, lacking coherence, and not following a clear chronological order. Initially, the medical team considered the possibility of a long-term homeless case, mental disorder, or cognitive decline due to undiagnosed illness, but subsequent signs quickly made this assumption insufficient. During the full-body examination, doctors noted on the man's wrists and ankles faint but highly symmetrical scars circling the joints, in a pattern consistent with traces of having been restrained with rope, cuffs, or similar materials for a long time. Along with that was uneven muscle atrophy, particularly in the lower body and back area, suggesting a prolonged period of restricted movement or confinement in a cramped space, where standing upright or walking freely did not occur regularly. In terms of neurology and behavior, the patient displayed excessive reactions to unexpected stimuli, easily startled when someone approached from behind, a tendency to curl up, draw in arms and legs in a defensive reflex when touched for medical checks, behaviors commonly seen in individuals who have experienced prolonged trauma and a high psychological pressure confinement environment. When provided with food and water, the man ate very slowly, portioning out each bite, each sip, as if the body had become accustomed to strictly controlling intake to avoid depleting life-sustaining resources, and showed clear signs of stress when the portion was increased faster than he could accept. Throughout the initial monitoring process, he almost never proactively recounted his circumstances, provided no information about where he had lived, people he had contacted, or the cause leading to his current condition, and whenever asked about the many years prior, he often fell into prolonged silence, blank stare, indicating severe disruption in organized recall ability. It was precisely the combination of emaciated physical condition, signs of long-term confinement, and abnormal psychological reactions that led the medical team to realize this was not a routine case. During the completion of mandatory administrative procedures, one medical staff member, while comparing facial features, bone structure, and some old scars with the database of unresolved missing persons cases, discovered a notable match with the file of Daniel Mercer, who had disappeared 3 years earlier during a hiking trip and was presumed a victim of a terrain accident with no body found. Further comparison of other identifying features, including estimated age, height, jaw structure, and previously recorded medical signs in the old file, quickly reinforced the likelihood that the man before them was Daniel. When this information was internally confirmed, the medical facility immediately contacted authorities, reporting that an individual with identifying features matching Daniel Mercer had appeared in a severely emaciated state, carrying no personal belongings, and showing many signs of having undergone prolonged confinement. For the authorities, this notification was shocking, because Daniel's file had long been closed with the assumption of an accident without criminal elements, and his reappearance in such a condition could not be explained by any previously accepted natural scenario. Daniel's appearance not only shattered the entire initial conclusion, but also forced involved agencies to re-ask questions about what truly happened after the day he disappeared, especially when his physical and psychological condition clearly indicated a process of being controlled, deprived of freedom and medical care for a long time. That very night, Daniel Mercer's file was officially reopened, shifted from archive status to emergency investigation, with coordination between medical units, law enforcement agencies, and departments previously involved in the search, marking the moment the case was no longer viewed as an unresolved terrain accident, but became a serious suspected criminal case, in which Daniel's reappearance was only the starting point for a series of questions that had never been raised during the 3 years he was missing. Right after Daniel Mercer was admitted in a severely emaciated condition, and his file was reopened, the top priority for the authorities was to absolutely confirm his identity, before any investigative hypotheses were officially proposed. While Daniel was still not stable enough to participate in extended sessions, law enforcement coordinated with the medical facility to carry out standard identification procedures right at the hospital. His fingerprints were carefully collected from both hands, under tightly controlled conditions, to avoid errors due to dry peeling and long-term damaged skin. This fingerprint sample was quickly entered into the federal comparison system, matched against civil databases and archived records from previous checks. The initial results showed a high match with Daniel Mercer's file, but per procedure, this was still not considered sufficient evidence for a final conclusion. In parallel, investigators requested dental record comparison, a highly reliable identification method in long-term missing persons cases. Daniel's dental records, stored from previous treatments, were sent to the forensic team for comparison with the actual condition of the man under treatment. Although Daniel's teeth showed signs of wear and deterioration due to prolonged lack of care, the overall structure, old fillings, and bite characteristics still showed clear alignment with the original records, further reinforcing the likelihood that this was the person who had gone missing 3 years earlier. To completely eliminate any remaining doubts, a rapid DNA process was deployed, allowing analysis and comparison of biological samples in a much shorter time than traditional testing. Daniel's DNA sample was matched against legally stored data from prior sources, and the results confirmed an absolute match, officially closing off any possibility of identity mistake. When all 3 independent identification methods yielded the same result, authorities declared that the man admitted to the medical facility was indeed Daniel Mercer, the individual reported missing during a hiking trip 3 years prior. Immediately after this confirmation, investigators proceeded to review the entire timeline from the day Daniel disappeared until the moment he reappeared. Data from the initial search file, Ranger Force reports, the last communication log with family, and administrative records throughout the period when the file was in passive search status were compiled to precisely determine the time frame during which Daniel had completely no presence in any civil, medical, or legal system. The conclusion showed that Daniel had been missing for a full 3 years, with no signs of using a different identity, no medical treatment records, no financial transactions, or recorded social interactions during that entire period. This information was particularly crucial, as it ruled out the possibility that Daniel had voluntarily left society or lived under another identity for an extended time. With identity absolutely confirmed and the missing time frame clarified, authorities were compelled to revisit the entire initial conclusion about the case. The emaciated physical condition, signs of long-term confinement, abnormal psychological reactions, and the inexplicable 3-year void that could not be explained by terrain accident or natural disorientation rendered the accidental disappearance hypothesis no longer legally valid. Even during the completion of identity confirmation procedures, Daniel Mercer's file was officially shifted in status from an unresolved missing person case to a criminal suspicion case, reflecting the high likelihood that his disappearance was related to organized criminal activity. This decision marked a critical turning point in the entire case, because from that moment, Daniel was no longer viewed as the victim of an unfortunate accident in a harsh environment, but as the center of a new criminal investigation, where the question was no longer where he had fallen, but who had controlled, confined, and deprived him of 3 years of his life outside all official oversight systems. To answer that core question, investigators immediately shifted focus to a comprehensive assessment of Daniel's physical condition, starting with building a detailed medical profile to determine whether what his body carried upon reappearance could be explained by a natural survival scenario in the wilderness, or could only be the consequence of prolonged and intentional confinement. Specialists in internal medicine, orthopedic trauma, nutrition, and forensics jointly conducted the full evaluation, beginning with analyzing the level of malnutrition Daniel was experiencing. Blood tests revealed prolonged protein deficiency, chronic electrolyte disorders, depletion of fat-soluble vitamins, and signs of mild to moderate liver damage, a picture typical of strictly controlled rations over a long period, rather than intermittent starvation, as commonly seen in those lost in the woods or surviving short-term. Daniel's muscle mass had decreased severely, especially in the muscle groups responsible for free movement, such as thighs, hips and lower back, while the arm muscles showed uneven atrophy, indicating his body had adapted to a restricted and repetitive pattern of movement, inconsistent with continuous travel in the wild. On Daniel's skin, doctors noted numerous old scars in various locations, some linear and parallel, others bearing characteristics of deep abrasions that had once become infected but were not properly treated, leading to prolonged healing and hardened scar tissue. Notably, there were no signs of mishealed fractures or severe untreated injuries, which are common in survivors of falls in rugged terrain, but instead a series of minor, accumulated injuries over time, reflecting a living environment, lacking basic medical care, yet not entirely chaotic. The most attention-grabbing part of the evaluation lay in the marks around the wrists and ankles, where faint circular scars appeared with high symmetry, located precisely at the anatomical sites commonly used to restrain a person. Under forensic physician analysis, the shape and depth of these scars did not match wearing outdoor gear, temporary ties, or random abrasions from climbing, but were compatible with being bound or restrained with rope, cuffs, or similar materials for an extended period, long enough to cause chronic soft tissue damage without acute necrosis. Additionally, the skin condition in these areas showed evidence of repeated pressure, interspersed with periods of release, a pattern typically seen in long-term confinement cases rather than single accidents. When assessing the possibility that Daniel could have survived on his own in the wilderness for 3 years, survival experts and environmental medicine specialists were consulted to compare his current physical state with documented cases of natural outdoor survival. Their conclusions were nearly unanimous. Daniel's degree of malnutrition did not align with someone foraging for food in the forest, because even in harsh conditions, small game hunting, gathering, or constant movement typically leads to a different type of depletion, accompanied by hand and foot injuries, thick calluses, and biological adaptations to the environment, factors entirely absent in Daniel. Instead, his body bore the imprint of being provided minimal, regular food amounts sufficient to sustain life, but not enough to recover or maintain health, a characteristic often seen in cases of confinement or control by a third party. Doctors also ruled out the possibility that Daniel lived in seclusion within an isolated community, or under voluntary conditions, because the complete absence of basic medical care signs, combined with improperly treated injuries, did not fit any form of stable life outside society. When synthesizing all the medical data, from prolonged malnutrition, untreated old wounds, clear restraint marks, to the reasonable exclusion of natural survival, the medical panel reached a unified conclusion that Daniel Mercer's condition could not be explained by terrain accident, getting lost, or voluntary isolation from society. The biological and clinical evidence pointed to only one consistent scenario: Daniel had been confined in a controlled environment, with systematic and prolonged restriction of freedom, long enough to leave irreversible marks on his body and health. This medical conclusion became a crucial foundation for the emerging criminal investigation, because it not only confirmed that Daniel had survived the 3 missing years, but also affirmed that survival occurred under the control of another person, transforming the case from a mysterious disappearance story into a serious unlawful imprisonment case. In parallel with completing the medical profile, investigative agencies requested an in-depth psychological evaluation of Daniel Mercer to determine the extent of mental trauma and his ability to cooperate in clarifying what happened during the 3 years he was missing. And the results revealed a complex psychological picture, consistent with cases of prolonged confinement rather than accident or natural survival. Right from the initial sessions with clinical psychologists, Daniel exhibited typical signs of complex PTSD, a disorder that often appears in individuals subjected to prolonged and repeated trauma in an inescapable environment, differing from single-event PTSD formed after a short-term incident. He reacted strongly to seemingly harmless stimuli, such as unexpected footsteps, the clinking of metal, or sudden light switches, frequently startling, increasing muscle tension, and entering a state of high alertness, even while in a safe medical environment. Experts noted that Daniel had a tendency to continuously scan the room with his eyes, paying particular attention to doors and exits, a reflexive behavior indicating his brain was still operating as if a threat could appear at any moment. In addition, Daniel frequently fell into states of dissociation, manifested through temporary disconnection from the surrounding environment, blank stares, delayed responses, or complete silence when asked about certain time periods. In these moments, he seemed no longer fully cognitively present, as if his mind detached from reality to avoid confronting painful memories, a common defense mechanism in victims of long-term control. Cognitive assessments showed Daniel struggled with sequencing events, especially extended periods, not due to intellectual decline, but because the brain actively disconnected from memory portions associated with feelings of helplessness and fear. Another clearly noted factor was learned helplessness, a psychological state formed when an individual is placed in situations with no ability to control outcomes, regardless of effort. Daniel often displayed passive resignation in small decision-making situations, such as choosing when to eat, rest, or participate in therapy, frequently responding with vague statements or letting others decide for him. When encouraged to express personal needs, he appeared confused, anxious, and tended to withdraw, as if asserting individual will could lead to negative consequences. Experts assessed that this reaction aligned with a long process of being punished or controlled whenever attempting resistance, causing the brain to learn to avoid any behavior that might be seen as challenging. Notably, Daniel exhibited clear avoidance behavior when asked about specific details related to the missing period, not just at the level of not remembering, but in the form of active evasion. He often changed the subject, gave answers that veered off to unrelated issues, or fell into prolonged silence when questions touched on human elements, enclosed locations, or actions repeated in cycles. In some cases, his breathing and heart rate increased markedly when questions were posed, forcing experts to halt evaluation sessions to avoid triggering re-traumatization. More importantly, psychologists emphasized that this avoidance did not carry characteristics of deliberately concealing information to evade legal responsibility, but aligned with the survival response of a victim previously threatened or punished for disclosing information. Daniel seemed to still operate under invisible rules formed during confinement, where speaking wrongly, speaking too much, or speaking at the wrong time could lead to severe consequences, making silence the safest choice. When synthesizing the evaluation results, the expert panel reached the assessment that Daniel's psychological state reflected prolonged trauma, including complex PTSD, deeply ingrained dissociation episodes, and learned helplessness, along with avoidance of providing information as a self-protection mechanism. These factors not only reinforced the prior medical conclusion that Daniel had been confined, but also explained why he could not immediately provide detailed or coherent testimony about what happened. For investigators, the psychological evaluation results were not only indirect evidence indicating the severity of what Daniel likely experienced, but also a clear warning that any efforts to gather information must be conducted with maximum patience and control, because any inappropriate pressure could push the victim back into deeper detachment and damage the ability to access the truth. Therefore, only after Daniel had stabilized physically and undergone many days of careful psychological evaluation did he agree to participate in an initial statement session under tightly controlled conditions, with the presence of a psychological expert, and what he began to describe, though fragmented and lacking timelines, for the first time sketched the initial outline of a prolonged confinement environment. Daniel could not pinpoint the exact location, only describing it as an enclosed space completely isolated from the outside, where natural light was almost non-existent or appeared only in very short and irregular intervals, causing him to gradually lose the ability to distinguish day from night. The space was limited in area, with a low ceiling, no proper windows, and did not allow him to move freely. All activities took place within a narrow range, enough to stand, sit, or lie down, but not enough to walk or exercise normally. Daniel described the smell of damp mold and old metal as something always present, along with repetitive mechanical sounds like distant opening and closing, details indicating that the confinement place was not a natural environment or temporary shelter, but a man-made structure intended for long-term use. He clearly stated that he did not live alone in that space in the sense of complete freedom. His daily routine was controlled by at least one other person, though he could not or did not dare specify identity, gender, or exact number. Food and water were not something he found or prepared himself, but were delivered on an irregular schedule, enough to sustain life, but not enough to restore health, and he had no say in the timing, portion, or type of food. Daniel said he was not allowed to decide when to sleep or when to stay awake, and gradually lost the ability to actively sense his own body's needs, because everything depended on permission or actions from the controller. When asked about direct communication, Daniel described very limited interactions, often occurring in silence, or through brief instructions without conversational nature, and he avoided detailed descriptions, because each attempt to recall caused his body to react with clear stress. An important point in the initial statement was that Daniel could not establish timelines for what he experienced. He did not know how long he had been there when he realized his previous life had ended, nor could he say how many days or months the periods lasted. The lack of natural light, no clock, calendar, or any social signals caused his concept of time to completely collapse, resulting in memories being stored as sensations and disconnected sequences of events, rather than a continuous timeline. Daniel repeatedly emphasized that he only knew time was passing because his body changed, because his strength declined, and because habits were repeated to the point of becoming instinct, not because he had the ability to measure or track days and months. When asked about other people involved besides himself and the controller, Daniel said he could not identify anyone, knew no names, had no clear faces, and in many cases did not even dare look directly, because that behavior had once made him feel unsafe. He could not say whether there were multiple people taking turns or only one individual, because the interactions were too brief and lacking distinguishing features, and his memories of people were tied more to feelings of fear than to specific images. Daniel also could not confirm whether or not there were other victims, because he had never witnessed the presence of anyone else confined, and there was no direct evidence that the space was used for other purposes. Throughout the initial statement, Daniel repeatedly paused, fell into prolonged silence or lost focus, forcing the session to be halted to ensure psychological safety, and experts assessed that the level of detail he could provide at this stage had reached the limit allowed by his recovering nervous system. Despite lacking names, locations, and specific timelines, Daniel's statement still held significant value, because it was consistent with the prior medical and psychological conclusions, confirming the existence of an organized confinement space, control of daily life by a third party, and prolonged deprivation of personal freedom. The fact that Daniel could not identify the other person or provide clear details was not viewed as a weakness in the statement, but as a direct consequence of the prolonged trauma and control process, in which silence and vagueness had been conditions for survival. For investigators, this initial statement was not intended to complete the full picture of the case, but served as a foundation confirming that what Daniel experienced was not a product of imagination or cognitive disorder, but a reality hidden for 3 years, and the very lack of specific information in his account actually reflected the effectiveness and cruelty of the confinement process he had survived. After Daniel Mercer's initial statement was recorded and preserved, investigators began a systematic analysis of inconsistencies, not to discredit the victim's account, but to identify points that could not be explained by existing hypotheses, and thereby guide a formal criminal investigation. The first task was to compare statement sessions by timeline, from the short initial exchanges in the hospital to later controlled sessions, in order to seek consistency or significant changes in Daniel's descriptions. The results showed that, although specific details remained limited, the core elements in his account did not change: the enclosed confinement space, control of daily life by a third party, ambiguity about time, and the feeling of complete deprivation of self-determination. Minor differences between sessions mainly related to phrasing or level of detail, consistent with his still unstable psychological state, and gradual cognitive recovery process, rather than carrying characteristics of fabrication or altering the story to fit circumstances. However, when placing Daniel's statement alongside objective data, a series of notable inconsistencies began to emerge, particularly related to the time factor and mobility. Daniel could not determine where he had been in geographical relation to the place he initially went missing, but some indirect descriptions he provided about temperature, humidity, air smell and environmental sounds did not align with being confined entirely in a wilderness area or makeshift structure near where he disappeared. Environmental analysis experts noted that these characteristics suggested an enclosed temperature-stable space with durable construction and independent existence from external natural conditions, something difficult to achieve if it were merely a spontaneous shelter in rugged terrain. The second inconsistency concerned Daniel's mobility in the early missing phase. Based on medical records, his level of emaciation indicated that free movement in the canyon environment for an extended period was nearly impossible, especially without proper gear, food and water. Yet Daniel's statement indicated he had been taken to the confinement space quite early after disappearing, though he could not remember exactly how. This created a significant logical gap. If Daniel lacked the capacity to move far on his own under those conditions, then his departure from the initial hiking area to the confinement location required third-party intervention, directly or indirectly. Investigators also paid attention to another key factor, the terrain knowledge that Daniel inadvertently displayed in his account. Although he could not specify the exact location, some of his descriptions about wind direction, echo in the enclosed space, air pressure changes, and the way artificial light reflected suggested the confinement place was not in simple or temporary structures. These observations exceeded the capacity for random guessing by an individual without access to technical information, especially in a prolonged state of control and emaciation. When cross-referencing with broader area maps and existing legal or abandoned structures within a large radius around where Daniel went missing, investigators found that identifying and accessing a site matching Daniel's description would require deep knowledge of terrain, infrastructure, and little-known routes, something unlikely to occur without prior preparation or assistance from someone familiar with the area. Another inconsistency, behavioral in nature, appeared when comparing Daniel's psychological reactions to those of people who had voluntarily lived isolated from society for long periods. Daniel displayed no signs of positive adaptation or minimal control over his living environment, but instead showed deep dependence and submissive reflexes, consistent with a controlled scenario rather than self-choice. The complete absence of any signs of preparation or survival strategy in his account further reinforced the assumption that he was not the one actively deciding how to exist during those 3 years. When synthesizing all these inconsistencies, from the inability to explain initial movement, the mismatch between described environmental conditions, and the disappearance terrain, to terrain knowledge exceeding individual capacity and behavioral patterns consistent with being controlled, investigators reached an important conclusion. The available data could not be explained by any previously proposed accident or self-isolation scenarios. The internal consistency of the inconsistencies, rather than weakening Daniel's statement, formed a logical structure pointing to the presence of organized criminal activity. On that basis, authorities officially decided to launch a full criminal investigation, shifting the case from the preliminary assessment phase to an active investigative process aimed at determining who removed Daniel from the hiking route, who had the capability to confine him for 3 years, and how such a serious act could occur undetected for an extended period. This decision marked a significant legal turning point, because from that moment, all data related to the case was no longer viewed as vague signs of an unsolved tragedy, but as potential evidence in an emerging criminal case. After the decision to launch a formal criminal investigation, focus quickly shifted to environmental forensics to search for objective clues still remaining on Daniel Mercer's own body, because in the context of fragmented statements and interrupted memories, physical traces became the most reliable data source to narrow the investigative scope. Forensic experts proceeded to collect samples of soil, dust, and minerals adhering to the skin, fingernails, toenail crevices, hair, and folds of the clothing Daniel was wearing when admitted, based on the assumption that even after a long time, these microscopic particles could still retain imprints of the environment where he had been confined. Initial analysis showed that the soil composition on Daniel's body was not consistent with the common surface soil around the initial hiking area at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, which is primarily weathered basalt and dry sediment. Instead, the collected samples contained high proportions of oxidized iron minerals, manganese, and some sulfide compounds, creating the characteristic dark brown color often seen in old mining environments or underground structures with high humidity. Notably, these soil particles were very small and sharp-edged, indicating they were not products of natural erosion on trail surfaces, but formed in an enclosed space with little exposure to wind and flowing water. In parallel with soil analysis, the forensic laboratory detected trace metal residues on Daniel's skin and clothing, including iron, zinc and copper traces at low but evenly distributed concentrations, particularly concentrated on the wrists, ankles, and lower back area. This distribution pattern did not align with random exposure in the wild, but suggested prolonged contact with old metal surfaces, possibly frames, iron bars, hooks or other fixed structures. Additionally, in the fabric fibers of the clothing, microscopic decayed wood fragments were found, with cellular structures broken down by prolonged moisture, unlike dry wood in forest environments, but similar to wood used in old constructions where preservation conditions were poor and ventilation limited. When cross-referencing these findings with environmental databases, experts assessed that the combination of metal-rich soil, oxidized iron traces, and decayed wood did not match most natural survival areas, but aligned with characteristics of abandoned mines or old mining facilities that once existed in many western mountain regions. From there, the investigative team began comparing forensic data with geological maps and maps of abandoned mines in the broad area around where Daniel went missing. Archived records showed that within a radius of dozens of miles around the Black Canyon, there were numerous metal mines that had ceased operations decades earlier, some no longer regularly monitored, with complex underground structures and temporarily used for various purposes after official closure. When comparing the mineral composition obtained from Daniel's body with soil and rock samples from these mines, experts found a high degree of similarity in a specific group of mines that had once extracted iron and manganese, leaving behind an environment rich in metal minerals and stable underground humidity. The next step was to cross-reference the microscopic wood traces with building materials recorded in the historical files of those mines, including reinforcing timber beams, temporary flooring, and auxiliary structures installed during the final operational phases. Results showed that the decay pattern and cellular composition of the wood matched that used in underground environments, lacking light and air circulation, further reinforcing the hypothesis that Daniel had been held in an enclosed space of old industrial origin. Investigators then proceeded to narrow down suspect areas by overlaying forensic data onto terrain, transportation and accessibility maps, to exclude locations too far or impractical for moving the victim from the initial hiking point in a short time. This analysis revealed that only a few abandoned mines fell within reachable range via little-used back roads, close enough for a third party to remove Daniel from the trail area without drawing attention, yet isolated enough to avoid regular oversight. Notably, these areas all shared common features outside cell coverage, rarely subjected to periodic safety checks, and with sufficiently complex underground structures to conceal human presence for an extended period. When the environmental forensic data was synthesized, the investigative picture began to become clearer. The traces on Daniel's body were not random or consequences of a natural environment, but products of prolonged exposure to an enclosed metal-rich humid space with man-made structure. Cross-referencing with abandoned mine maps not only provided a specific direction for the investigation, but also allowed narrowing to a finite set of locations where confinement hypotheses could be verified through field operations. For investigators, the environmental forensic results at this point went beyond a supporting role and became the key link connecting Daniel's still vague statements to specific physical traces, allowing the victim's fragmented perceptions to be transformed into verifiable, excludable, and traceable data in real space, thereby significantly narrowing the range of speculation about where he had been confined during the 3 years he was missing. Based on those results, the investigation moved into the systematic phase of identifying the confinement location, in which specialized teams conducted sweeps of all structures, potentially matching the inferred conditions, starting with checking unregistered cabins scattered in the western Colorado mountains, particularly those existing outside official management systems, without clear postal addresses, and almost absent from tax records or building permits. Field teams coordinated with local agencies to inspect each cabin identified through satellite imagery, drone flight data, and information from sparse resident communities, focusing on places showing signs of continuous use, but no open living activity. Many cabins were quickly ruled out when on-site checks revealed seasonal use, traces of normal family activity, or lack of sufficiently enclosed structures to confine a person long-term without drawing attention. Other cabins, though isolated, lacked features matching forensic conclusions, such as no signs of oxidized metal, no underground spaces, or inability to maintain the stable humidity needed to produce the microscopic traces found on Daniel's body. As the list of unregistered cabins narrowed without yielding convincing results, investigative focus shifted to abandoned mines, which better aligned with the identified environmental indicators. Investigators cross-referenced historical mine maps with real-world access data, prioritizing mines with relatively intact tunnels, formerly extracting iron or manganese, and within reasonable travel range from Daniel's initial disappearance site at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. Safety survey teams were deployed to assess each mine, both to determine suitability as a confinement site and to ensure no danger to investigative personnel from collapse risks or accumulated toxic gases. Many mines were eliminated early due to complete collapse, deep flooding, or overly public entrances, making long-term secret confinement activity impractical. Other mines, though retaining underground structures, lacked evidence of recent human presence, no signs of living activity, no stable water source, or no auxiliary structures like timber beams or temporary flooring, matching forensic findings. In parallel with checking isolated sites, investigators systematically ruled out residential areas and popular trails, based on the principle that confining a person for 3 years requires high levels of control and secrecy, difficult to maintain near densely populated areas, or trails frequently visited by hikers. Areas near towns, resorts, popular camping spots, and tightly managed trails were quickly removed from the suspect list due to excessive discovery risk and inconsistency with Daniel's description of a space completely isolated from society. As data layers continued to be overlaid, from environmental forensics, accessibility, oversight levels, to logistical feasibility, the suspect range gradually narrowed to a handful of locations outside main transportation axes, not in residential zones, and not on popular trails. Among them, one particular structure drew the investigative team's attention, an isolated facility deep in the mountains, not recorded as a civilian cabin, and not fully matching official mining records. Satellite data showed the structure had existed for decades, with signs of minor modifications over time, but no recent legal use records, and more importantly, located in an area with geological composition compatible with mineral samples obtained from Daniel's body. During preliminary external approach, survey teams noted the presence of oxidized old metal, decayed wood fragments with structures similar to analyzed microscopic samples, and restricted natural light, indicating this could be an enclosed space suitable for long-term confinement. The site also lay outside cell coverage, rarely subject to periodic checks, and had back roads allowing access without passing through residential areas or official checkpoints. Discovering this isolated structure did not mean immediately confirming it as Daniel's confinement place, but it fully met the criteria independently built from medical, psychological, statement, and environmental forensic records. For investigators, this marked the first time in the entire case that a specific location emerged as a serious candidate, where unlawful confinement hypotheses could be verified through detailed on-site examination. The convergence of factors at this structure signaled the end of the theoretical narrowing phase and opened a crucial shift to field verification, where inferences and indirect data would face direct physical evidence, though at that point, all conclusions remained cautious to ensure accuracy and safety for the investigation entering its most sensitive stage. Right after the isolated structure was identified as the primary suspect point from the previous narrowing steps, the investigative force conducted an on-site forensic examination, following standard procedures, viewing this as the key step to confirm whether this space was truly where Daniel Mercer had been confined throughout his missing period. Access to the scene was carried out with high control due to its deep location in a remote area, narrow entry paths, many sections eroded naturally, and no signs of periodic maintenance, indicating the structure was not within legal use or regular community activity. Upon entering inside, investigators noted the space's distinctly enclosed nature, with thick rock walls, interspersed with old metal plates manually reinforced, low ceiling, no proper windows, and a rudimentary ventilation system only sufficient for minimal air, creating an environment lacking natural light, stifling, and highly controllable. The spatial layout showed it was not designed for free living, but to restrict movement, with areas roughly but intentionally divided, fitting a prolonged confinement model. During the overall survey, the examination team quickly recognized many signs of long-term habitation, including repeated wear marks on the floor at certain fixed positions, scratch streaks on walls at heights corresponding to an adult's reach, and surface areas with uneven signs of touching, rubbing, or cleaning over time. These signs indicated continuous human presence within the restricted space, rather than short-term or accidental intrusion. No personal items with clear ownership were found, such as individual clothing, belongings, or documents, consistent with the hypothesis that the confined person was not allowed to keep any possessions that could aid free movement or communication, but indirect traces still existed. Like frayed fabric fibers caught in metal crevices, long-adhered organic material fragments on wood surfaces, and cyclically accumulated dirt, reflecting controlled living over an extended period. A particularly valuable discovery appeared in the central area of the structure, where investigators noted the existence of a lock and chain system that had been disassembled but left clear traces, including metal hooks fixed to the wall, circular wear on the floor, and deep oxidation at contact points, indicating these items had been used frequently and under strain for a long time. The position and height of the metal hooks matched restraining wrists and ankles, aligning with the symmetrical scars and restraint signs recorded in Daniel's medical file, creating a direct link between the scene and the victim's physical condition. Near this area, a rudimentary bed frame was discovered, constructed from old metal and wood, without a proper mattress, but only a hard surface with uneven indentations, reflecting continuous use over a long period without any replacement or improvement. The size and position of the bed frame indicated the person lying there could not fully stretch out, forcing the body to adapt to a cramped posture, consistent with the muscle atrophy and postural deformities noted by doctors when Daniel reappeared. Additionally, the space around the bed frame showed no signs of personal activity, such as entertainment items, auxiliary lighting, or independent heating, indicating rest here was more enforced than voluntary. During the examination, investigators systematically and meticulously collected physical evidence, including soil samples from the floor and cracks, metal fragments from the lock hooks and remaining chain segments, fabric fibers adhering to the bed frame, along with wood and metal material samples from frequently contacted surfaces. All evidence was sealed, with coordinates and exact positions recorded for cross-referencing with microscopic samples previously collected from Daniel's body and clothing during prior medical examinations. In parallel with sample collection, the examination team also noted the absence of elements indicating free or varied living, such as a full cooking area, personal storage space, signs of multiple people living simultaneously, or convenient escape routes, reinforcing the assessment that the structure was used to confine a single individual long-term, with high control and minimized escape potential. The physical signs at the scene, from the enclosed space structure, prolonged habitation marks, lock and chain system, to the rudimentary bed frame, when linked to Daniel's medical and psychological records, formed a consistent and mutually supporting chain of evidence. The on-site examination aimed not only to confirm the connection between this location and the victim, but also to build a solid physical foundation for subsequent investigative steps, where collected evidence would play a pivotal role in reconstructing the confinement process, determining the extent of abuse, and clarifying criminal responsibility of the individual or group that used this structure for criminal purposes. At the conclusion of the examination, though no final conclusion was drawn, all collected data and evidence were sufficient to strongly reinforce the hypothesis that this was not a harmless abandoned facility, but a site intentionally used for long-term human confinement, paving the way for deeper investigative steps to fully clarify the entire mechanism and motive behind the case. From the physical evidence collected at the isolated structure and the prior environmental forensic analyses, the process of identifying the perpetrator gradually narrowed in a specific direction, as investigators realized that the confinement site could not have existed and been maintained for years without stable control by an individual deeply familiar with the area. Through reviewing residency records, ranger data, reports of unauthorized entry, and civil complaints related to the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, over more than a decade, one name emerged with unusual frequency: Ethan Crowley. Crowley did not appear in any legal land ownership records, but his name was repeatedly noted in scattered reports of illegal tent setup, occupation of old cabins, trespassing into abandoned mines, and verbal threats toward hikers or public service personnel. Documents showed Crowley had lived sporadically in the area for many years, without a fixed residence address, frequently moving between abandoned structures and areas outside official oversight, exploiting the rugged terrain and no-signal zones to avoid attention from authorities. Crowley's history of unauthorized residency was recorded from years before Daniel Mercer went missing, including ranger warning citations, reports of breaking into abandoned cabins, and illegal entries into restricted areas, though most of these incidents did not lead to criminal prosecution due to lack of direct evidence or because Crowley disappeared before authorities could approach. When cross-referencing these timelines with the time Daniel vanished, investigators noted significant overlap between Crowley's documented presence in the area and the period the victim was completely absent from all oversight systems. Crowley's connection to the crime scene was established more clearly through analysis of access paths, habitation traces, and rudimentary building materials at the confinement structure, indicating the user of the space had detailed knowledge of terrain, water sources, discrete approach routes, and the ability to sustain long-term living without external community contact. These characteristics matched Crowley's behavioral profile, described in old reports as having a tendency towards self-isolation, viewing public areas as personal territory, and reacting hostilely to the presence of strangers. Investigators also gathered statements from several hikers and scattered local residents who had encountered Crowley over the years, and described him as a man with aggressive demeanor, frequently expressing hatred toward tourists, especially solo hikers whom he accused of invading his living space. These statements not only strengthened the link between Crowley and the crime scene, but also gradually clarified the motive. Rather than an impulsive act or kidnapping for financial gain, the evidence pointed to Crowley's motive as territorial control and hatred of hikers, stemming from a distorted perception that trails and wilderness areas were his personal property. According to preliminary psychological analysis based on Crowley's behavior and history, he tended to view lone hikers as threats to the order he imposed, while seeing the control, confinement, and deprivation of their freedom as a way to assert absolute power in the space he considered his own. This explained why Daniel Mercer, a solo hiker, disappeared without clear accident traces, while aligning with Daniel's initial statement about someone controlling his daily life, but not for ransom demands or specific material gain. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Crowley had been complained against for violent threats toward previous hikers, but these cases were not pursued fully because victims left the area soon after and suffered no serious injuries. These precedents showed Crowley's behavior escalating over time, from verbal threats to spatial control, and finally to long-term human confinement. Crowley's familiarity with abandoned mines and unregistered cabins in the area also explained how he could maintain a confinement site undetected, utilizing existing structures and making minimal modifications to serve criminal purposes. All collected data from unauthorized residency history, close ties to the crime scene, witness statements, to behavioral motive analysis, gradually converged into a consistent conclusion that Ethan Crowley was not merely a random presence in the area, but the individual with the highest likelihood of controlling the confinement structure and directly responsible for depriving Daniel Mercer of freedom for 3 years. Identifying Crowley as the prime suspect was not the result of a single piece of evidence, but a systematic synthesis of multiple investigative layers, forming a complete picture of an individual living on society's fringes, harboring hatred toward hikers, and turning wilderness into territory controlled through violence, thereby laying the foundation for subsequent investigative steps to establish criminal responsibility, clearly and irrevocably. Based on Ethan Crowley being identified as the central suspect and the evidence collected from the confinement site, investigators began reconstructing the approach and abduction of Daniel Mercer as a deliberate sequence of actions, prepared based on deep knowledge of the terrain, hiker habits, and inherent vulnerabilities of remote trails in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. Analysis of trailhead registry data, statements from other hikers present in the area at the same time, and environmental traces showed that Crowley habitually appeared on trail sections far from crowded areas, especially places with weak signal, steep terrain, and where hikers were forced to move slowly or pause to rest. These were ideal positions for approach without drawing attention, while allowing the perpetrator to control the situation if the victim resisted. Investigators believe Crowley had observed Daniel beforehand, not just in a few random minutes, but possibly over a sufficient period to assess that Daniel was traveling alone, carrying adequate but not excessive gear, and had no plans to move with a group, factors making him a suitable target for a discreet abduction. The approach is believed to have occurred under the guise of fake assistance, a common but particularly effective tactic in wilderness environments, where help between strangers is often seen as normal and necessary. Crowley, with the appearance of someone long familiar with the region, may have approached Daniel by offering warnings about bad weather conditions, dangerous trail sections ahead, or suggesting a safer alternative route, exploiting the natural trust of a solo hiker toward seemingly reasonable and protective information. Investigators assess that Crowley did not use violence right from the start, as that would increase the risk of causing obvious injuries or leaving struggle traces on the trail. Instead, he built a situation where Daniel voluntarily accompanied him for a short distance, enough to move out of random sight from others. Once Daniel was brought to a position obscured from view, where terrain limited quick movement or escape, the discrete control process was deployed. Based on Daniel's medical records, initial injury traces indicate control was achieved without immediate serious harm, most likely through sudden approach from behind, using just enough force to unbalance the victim or temporarily impair resistance, combined with direct threats to force Daniel to comply without shouting or strong resistance. The absence of clear struggle signs in the trail area where Daniel vanished reinforces the hypothesis that control occurred quickly, precisely, and at a position carefully chosen by Crowley. After gaining control of the victim, transportation to the confinement site was carried out via unofficial routes, avoiding popular trails and areas likely to encounter others. Investigators believe Crowley used terrain knowledge to lead Daniel through side paths, mountain crevices, and dense forest sections rarely visited, where footprints were quickly erased by natural conditions or hard to distinguish from old traces. Daniel's initial emaciation state, noted upon reappearance, indicates that from the early abduction phase, he was severely restricted in nutrition and movement, consistent with being forced to travel under control, possibly bound or made to walk in disadvantaged postures, reducing accurate recall of routes or timelines. Transportation likely did not occur in one single effort, but was divided into short stages, utilizing discrete stopping points to prevent Daniel from observing, orienting, or attempting escape. The lack of any direct witnesses throughout this phase shows Crawley chose timing and environmental conditions calculatedly, possibly late in the day, when trail traffic dropped sharply, light weakened, and weather began turning bad, adding natural cover for the crime. As they neared the confinement structure, Crawley most likely employed additional psychological control measures, such as threatening consequences for resistance, or promising that cooperation would keep Daniel safe, to maintain compliance and reduce resistance risk at the most sensitive moment. Investigators assess that the entire approach and abduction method reflects a non-impulsive behavioral pattern, built from years of living in the area, familiarity with hiker behavior, and a clear territorial control motive. Daniel's disappearance without accident or struggle signs, combined with long-term confinement, without any attempts to contact the outside world, shows Crawley succeeded in imposing power, right from the initial approach moment, turning what seemed like a harmless trail encounter into the starting point for 3 years of complete deprivation of freedom. From the reconstructed approach and abduction method, investigators continued to clarify the confinement process that Ethan Crawley applied to Daniel Mercer, viewing it as the key factor to understand why the victim could be controlled for 3 years without leaving any contact traces or successful escape attempts. Based on Daniel's initial statement, forensic signs at the scene, and medical analysis, the confinement process was determined to be systematic, repeated daily, and designed to gradually eliminate the victim's physical and mental self-sufficiency. Right from the early phase of being brought into the confinement structure, Daniel's daily routine was placed under absolute control, with no elements of personal choice existing. Times for waking, eating, resting, and moving within the narrow space all followed a fixed rhythm imposed by Crawley, creating a state of complete dependence where Daniel no longer had the ability to naturally distinguish day from night. The amount of food provided was at a minimal level, enough to sustain life, but not enough to restore strength, leading to the prolonged malnutrition recorded in the medical file. Eating did not occur according to familiar societal schedules, but at unstable times, causing Daniel to gradually lose the ability to predict and control his body's basic needs, a control technique commonly seen in intentional confinement cases. In parallel with routine control, light and communication were strictly restricted to weaken perception of time and reality. The confinement space had almost no natural light, and any artificial light source, if present, was only turned on for short periods without a fixed cycle, preventing Daniel from forming a stable biological rhythm. Prolonged lack of light not only affected physically, such as vision impairment and sleep disorders, but also profoundly impacted psychologically, increasing feelings of confusion, disorientation, and dependence on the controller as the sole reference point. Communication was restricted to the maximum extent, not only in Daniel's complete isolation from the outside world, but also in how Crawley interacted with him, often using only brief commands without explanation or providing information about time, location, or reason for confinement. This absence of human-like dialogue caused Daniel to gradually lose the ability to argue or self-assert, replaced by passive compliance. When Daniel showed signs of resistance, asking questions, or trying to understand his situation, psychological punishment forms were applied instead of direct physical violence, to avoid leaving obvious injuries while still achieving high control effectiveness. These forms included reducing food, extending time in complete darkness, suddenly changing routine rules, or creating absolute silence for long periods, causing Daniel to fall into continuous anxiety and insecurity. According to psychological assessment, these measures effectively weakened resistance will, forming learned helplessness, where the victim believed any action against the current situation was futile and only led to worse consequences. Notably, the confinement process was not random or chaotic, but showed stable and intentional maintenance over a long period, indicating Crawley not only wanted to deprive Daniel of freedom short-term, but intended to keep him in a controlled state indefinitely. Maintaining the confinement structure, providing minimal survival needs, and avoiding fatal injuries reflected a control objective rather than destruction, consistent with the previously identified territorial motive. Daniel was not informed of any timeline for ending confinement, making each passing day an indefinite sequence, gradually weakening the concept of future and hope, a key factor in maintaining prolonged compliance. Investigators also assessed that Crowley actively created dependence by being both the sole threat and the minimal provider of life needs, forcing Daniel to tie his survival safety to compliant behavior. This control occurred not only physically, but deeply psychologically, causing Daniel over time to reduce efforts to remember details, orient spatially, or plan escape, because any proactive action was punished or neutralized. This intentional prolonged confinement process explained why, upon reappearance, Daniel was not only physically emaciated, but also showed slow cognition, cautious reactions, and difficulty recounting timelines. Because over the 3 years, his self-sufficiency and perception had been systematically eroded. For investigators, clarifying the confinement process aimed not only to reconstruct what Daniel experienced, but also to prove that Crowley's actions fully met the elements of prolonged unlawful imprisonment, maintained through psychological and physical control, thereby strengthening the legal foundation for pursuing criminal responsibility at the most serious level. From the conclusions about the intentional prolonged confinement process and the systematic control that Ethan Crowley imposed, authorities shifted to the rescue and arrest phase with a dual objective: eliminating the existing threat in the area, and gathering sufficient evidence to permanently end any possibility of reoffending. Locating Crowley was carried out as a discrete tracking operation based on synthesizing historical movement data, recent ranger reports of unauthorized entry, newly discovered habitation traces around abandoned structures, and the suspect's pattern of avoiding social contact. Analysis showed Crowley maintained a habit of moving within a narrow core area where terrain was complex, visibility limited, and human presence infrequent, while utilizing high points to observe approach routes. From this data, several potential locations were established and filtered by criteria showing recent habitation signs, but no exposed stable supply sources, consistent with a prolonged reclusive lifestyle. Once the priority location was narrowed, the approach plan was built with high detail, prioritizing safety and minimizing risk of direct confrontation in unfavorable terrain conditions. The plan included simultaneous deployment of multiple approach vectors from different directions, using mobile units experienced in climbing slopes, traversing forest, and moving in limited visibility, combined with soft blockades to control escape routes without creating early warning signals. The approach timing was chosen based on light, wind, and temperature factors to reduce the suspect's ability to detect movement from afar, while ensuring internal observation and coordination capabilities for the force. Throughout the approach, teams adhered to absolute silence principles, avoided leaving new traces that could be noticed, and continuously updated positions according to the pre-scouted advance rhythm. Upon closing in on the suspect area, the force discovered Crowley residing in another makeshift structure within the same operational zone, but not coinciding with Daniel's confinement site, indicating the suspect had proactively changed residences after the victim's disappearance to sever direct links. The arrest was executed quickly and cleanly according to the prepared scenario, exploiting the element of surprise to neutralize resistance reflexes. Crowley was safely subdued in a short time, with no serious conflict occurring, consistent with prior assessment that the suspect tended to avoid confrontation when losing control advantage. Immediately after subduing, the suspect was separated from the scene and transferred to a secure area for initial procedures, while remaining teams simultaneously launched emergency searches within legally permitted scope to seize related physical evidence. Evidence seizure was conducted systematically, focusing on items directly reflecting confinement and control behavior, including locking tools, chains, metal hooks, binding ropes, rudimentary building materials matching traces at the confinement scene, along with minimal living items indicating long-term presence in isolated conditions. Additionally, the force collected clothing and footwear showing wear patterns corresponding to the area's terrain, observation tools and territorial marking items around nearby trails, along with scattered notes reflecting spatial control mindset and monitoring of passers-by. Each piece of evidence was sealed, numbered, with coordinates and seizure conditions recorded for future forensic cross-referencing and chain of custody. In parallel with evidence seizure, the surrounding area was swept to ensure no auxiliary structures or secret escape routes that could contain additional evidence or pose danger. The entire operation was coordinated to minimize environmental impact and avoid disturbing remaining traces, preserving evidence value. This rescue and arrest not only practically ended the threat to hikers in the area, but also created a decisive anchor for the investigative file, as for the first time the connection between suspect, scene and confinement behavior chain was established through the combination of identity, physical evidence, and spatial context. For Daniel Mercer, though not directly involved at the arrest moment, due to health and psychological condition, the operation's results transformed what he experienced from solitary testimony into a specific, consistent, and verifiable evidence system, laying a solid foundation for comprehensive and irrevocable criminal prosecution. After the rescue and arrest operation for Ethan Crowley was completed, the entire case moved into the phase of complete investigation and prosecution, where the goal was no longer identifying the suspect, but building an irrefutable legal file strong enough to withstand any counterarguments in court. Interagency investigative teams began by systematizing all evidence collected throughout the process, from the confinement scene, Crowley's unauthorized residences, to the medical, psychological, and environmental forensic results of Daniel Mercer. Each piece of evidence was re-examined according to the chain of custody, clearly determining the seizure time, responsible personnel, sealing conditions, and direct connection to the criminal acts, to eliminate any possibility of disputes over legality or risks of claims of tampered evidence. Metal samples, chains, lock hooks, fabric fibers, soil samples, and wood materials were cross-referenced between the confinement scene and the microscopic traces found on Daniel's body and clothing upon reappearance, creating a direct physical link between the victim and the confinement space. The medical file was incorporated as the central element, not only to describe the emaciated condition, but also to prove the prolonged and systematic nature of the confinement, through conclusions about chronic malnutrition, untreated old injuries, symmetrical restraint marks, and physiological disorders that could not form under natural survival conditions. In parallel with physical evidence, Daniel's statements were reanalyzed, using a progressive method, divided into stable information layers and cognitive gaps, rather than seeking absolute timeline matches. Investigators focused on identifying consistent elements throughout the account, such as descriptions of the confinement space, the feeling of controlled daily life, the frequent presence of a single individual, and the inability to leave freely, then cross-referencing these elements with the actual scene and seized evidence. Points Daniel could not precisely determine, such as timelines or movement routes, were placed in the context of confirmed psychological trauma, thereby not weakening the statement, but instead reinforcing the authenticity of the prolonged confinement experience. In the opposite direction, Ethan Crowley's statements during interrogation were closely compared with objective data. Crowley's inability to provide reasonable explanations for the presence of confinement tools, long-term habitation traces in the isolated structure, and personal connection to the area where Daniel was held created serious contradictions, especially when cross-referenced with his unauthorized residency history and prior reports of threatening hikers. Investigators noted that the gaps and evasions in Crowley's statements were not minor details but key points indicating intent to conceal criminal acts. On the basis of synthesizing evidence and statements, charge determination was carried out cautiously, but decisively, based on current legal framework and the severity of the acts. The charged acts included prolonged unlawful abduction and confinement, intentional deprivation of personal freedom, causing serious physical and mental harm, along with aggravating circumstances related to committing the acts over an extended period, in a remote area to avoid detection by authorities. In particular, the systematic control factor and territorial motive were viewed as circumstances reflecting high danger level, because the acts were not impulsive but stably maintained for many years. Once charges were established, the entire file was reorganized in logical sequence, clarifying the causal relationship between each specific act by Crowley and the direct consequences for Daniel, from physical emaciation to prolonged psychological disorders. Expert analyses from doctors, psychologists, and environmental forensic specialists were included as supporting documents to explain to the court how this scientific evidence tightly linked to the victim's experience. Before transferring the file, a final review round was conducted to ensure no internal contradictions, no missing evidence links, and all conclusions had independent verifiable basis. When the file was officially transferred to the prosecutor's office, the investigative phase closed, marking the shift from clarifying the truth to pursuing criminal responsibility publicly. For Daniel Mercer, this moment held meaning far beyond legal procedure, because the years of deprived freedom no longer existed as fragmented memories of a traumatized individual, but had been recognized by the justice system as a complete case, where every painful detail was placed correctly in a file aimed toward justice. After the prosecution file was completed and pre-trial procedures concluded, the case officially entered the public trial phase, marking the moment the entire chain of events, spanning many years, was placed before the jury to comprehensively evaluate criminal responsibility. The trial took place amid tightened security, reflecting the severity of the charges, as well as the potential danger that Ethan Crowley's actions had posed to the community of hikers in the area. In the prosecution's presentation, the entire investigative process was recreated in logical order, starting from the moment Daniel Mercer disappeared at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, the unsuccessful search efforts, the initial erroneous conclusion, to the reappearance event in an emaciated state, and subsequent forensic discoveries. The prosecution did not focus on recounting emotions or speculation, but relied on standardized evidence in the file, emphasizing the direct connection between the confinement scene, seized physical evidence, and the confirmed physical and psychological injuries through medical examination. Experts were summoned to clarify before the court that Daniel's chronic malnutrition, symmetrical restraint marks, untreated old wounds, and complex psychological disorders could not have formed in any natural survival scenario, but were only consistent with a prolonged, controlled, and intentional confinement process. The jury was also presented with detailed analysis of the confinement structure, spatial layout, long-term habitation traces, and lock and chain system, thereby understanding that the site was not a temporary shelter or accidentally used abandoned area, but a space maintained to deprive a person of freedom. When Daniel's testimony was presented, the court applied necessary protective measures to avoid causing further psychological trauma, while clarifying that his inability to precisely determine timelines or detailed sequences did not weaken the testimony's value, as those cognitive gaps had been consistently explained by the diagnosis of complex PTSD and dissociation. The defense focused on denying criminal intent, attempting to portray Crowley's actions as the isolated presence of an individual living on society's fringes, while questioning the direct connection between the defendant and Daniel's confinement. However, these arguments gradually lost weight as the jury considered the overall evidence, particularly the matches between seized physical evidence, forensic traces, and Crowley's prolonged unauthorized residency history in the area. Contradictions in the defendant's statements, along with the inability to reasonably explain the origin of confinement tools and long-term habitation traces, were viewed as seriously unfavorable factors. After the prolonged adversarial process, the jury reached a conclusion on Ethan Crowley's criminal responsibility, determining that the defendant had committed prolonged unlawful abduction and confinement, intentionally depriving personal freedom, and causing serious physical and mental harm to the victim. In the reasoning section, the court emphasized that this was not an impulsive act or unintended incident, but a systematic sequence of actions maintained over many years, with the goal of absolute control and isolating the victim from the outside world. The prolonged nature, remote location to avoid detection, and use of psychological punishment, instead of overt violence, were viewed as factors increasing the act's danger level. When pronouncing sentence, the court considered factors related to the defendant's background, but concluded that the consequences for the victim and risk to the community required a long-term prison sentence with strong deterrent effect. The sentence was pronounced with a strict imprisonment term, accompanied by stringent conditions restricting any future parole considerations, to ensure the defendant had no opportunity to access and endanger others in similar contexts. With this verdict, the criminal proceedings officially concluded, marking the end of a legal journey spanning from the case's reopening to the clear establishment of criminal responsibility. For Daniel Mercer, the verdict could not erase the years of confinement or the lingering injuries, but the court's public acknowledgement and thorough handling of the crime provided a necessary closure, confirming that what he experienced was not an accident or misunderstanding, but a serious crime that the justice system had recognized and judged according to its true nature. After the verdict was pronounced, and the formal proceedings officially closed, the focus of the story shifted to the long-term consequences and the reality that Daniel Mercer and those around him had to face, because ending a criminal case does not mean its impacts disappear. In terms of health, Daniel entered a prolonged and complex recovery phase, where physical and psychological issues were tightly intertwined. The prolonged malnutrition over many years left irreversible consequences in the short term, including muscle mass loss, metabolic disorders, and silent internal organ damage that only became apparent as the body began readapting to normal living conditions. Physical strength recovery proceeded slowly, requiring continuous medical monitoring and a carefully designed routine to avoid shocking a body accustomed to prolonged deprivation. In parallel, the previously diagnosed psychological disorders did not vanish after the trial, but continued to profoundly affect Daniel's daily life. Sudden panic attacks, sleep disturbances, startle responses to minor stimuli, and persistent feelings of insecurity required ongoing intensive psychological treatment, with the goal not of completely erasing memories, but of learning to live with them without being dominated. Daniel's daily life thus remained restricted, with specific adjustments to ensure stability, from quiet living spaces and fixed schedules to avoiding environments that could trigger feelings of control or isolation. In family relationships, the case left profound and irreversible changes. The reunion after 3 years of disappearance did not carry the complete image of a return as the family had once hoped, but was a slow, sometimes painful reconnection process, where loved ones had to learn to understand and accept a Daniel different from the one who left before the fateful hiking trip. The family was both the most important support and had to confront feelings of helplessness upon realizing they could not fully soothe or repair the injuries Daniel carried. Moments of closeness were interspersed with prolonged silences, where everyone was aware that some experiences could not be fully shared through words. Nevertheless, the clarification of the case and establishment of criminal responsibility provided the family with a necessary closure, ending years lived in doubt, self-blame, and unanswered questions about whether Daniel had chosen to leave them. For the local community around the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, the incident left a deep mark, changing perceptions of safety in natural spaces long viewed as wild but harmless. Local management agencies conducted reviews of monitoring procedures, inspections of abandoned structures, and strengthened warnings for solo hikers, not just as an immediate response, but as a long-term effort to restore community trust. Daniel's story became a persistent reminder that even in spaces seemingly detached from society, criminal acts could exist and persist, if not detected in time. In informal discussions, many local residents admitted they had once seen the presence of reclusive individuals in the area as a normal part of mountain life, and the case forced them to reevaluate the fragile boundary between personal freedom and hidden risks. In administrative and legal terms, Daniel Mercer's file was closed with the final status of a resolved criminal case, with an enforceable sentence, and no remaining open elements regarding criminal responsibility. However, closing the file did not mean the story ended completely in societal consciousness, as the data and lessons drawn from the case continued to be used in training, evaluation, and improvement of procedures related to missing persons and safety in wilderness environments. For Daniel, the present was not defined by returning to his old life, but by efforts to build a new one within the limits of what remained after 3 years of deprived freedom. His existence was proof of human survival capacity under the harshest conditions, but also a reminder that such survival always came with an immeasurable price. When the case file was archived in official records, what remained was not just sentences and legal documents, but an ongoing reality, where the crime's consequences continued to ripple through each individual, family, and community, touched by a disappearance once seen as an accident, but ultimately confirmed as an intentional crime. Daniel Mercer's story is not just an isolated case in the wilderness, but directly reflects many very real challenges of American life today: the fragility of personal safety, gaps in societal oversight, and the price paid when people overly believe that free space equals no risk. Daniel disappeared, not due to an unavoidable accident, but because he went alone, in an area without communication signal, and trusted what seemed like harmless help on the trail. In the context of modern America, where hiking, van life, and living close to nature are celebrated as symbols of personal freedom, this story reminds that freedom must always come with defensive awareness and preparation. The fact that Ethan Crowley could live illegally for years in public areas, build a confinement structure, and control a victim reveals a worrying reality: gray zones between personal freedom rights and community responsibility still exist, especially in sparsely populated and low oversight places. The first lesson is never to downplay basic safety measures. Share routes, go in groups when possible, and be wary of strangers with controlling or imposing behavior, even if they wear the guise of help. The second lesson lies in how society responds after tragedy. The fact that Daniel's file was once closed as a terrain accident shows the system sometimes chooses simple explanations to close unease, rather than continuing to ask hard questions. Finally, Daniel's recovery journey emphasizes that justice does not end with the sentence, but also in society acknowledging victims' prolonged trauma and supporting their reintegration. In American life today, the biggest lesson from this story is safety is not excessive fear, but shared responsibility of individuals toward themselves, communities toward each other, and the system toward the most vulnerable people. If you feel Daniel Mercer's story brings you deep reflections on safety, justice, and human resilience, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in real stories behind disappearances that seemed unsolvable. Thank you for watching until the end of the video, and see you again in the next episode, where we will continue delving into the hidden corners where the truth needs to be spoken.